I seem to have a little scratchy throat, and whether I've got the hysteria, which is not my MMPI pattern, or something allergy, I don't know. But I'm sorry if I sound scratchy, and if I start choking to death, we may have to call off the class, but I hope we can manage it. Please pass that reading list around. And let's see what else I have. Always hesitate to pass anything out before you start lecturing, because due to the nature of the graduate student's mind and conditioning, you can't pass anything out without there feeling compelled to start reading it. Then I don't want you to start reading that. Yeah. I decided not to call off our session next week. My wife says that any college professor who frets about whether he will, quote, have material to fill up the time is out of his mind, and it never happened to me in my career. So I'm going to, next week will be somewhat disorganized, because I'm going to talk about a set of things that are only very loosely related. The certain aspects of strong etiology or strong influence, and psychopathology, a special kind of causation that psychologists almost never know about and should, because it's extremely common in the social sciences, and that is the Inus condition, I-N-U-S, after Professor Mackey, who invented it. And then I'm going to tell you about a couple of goofy indexes of theory performance that I've been working on, and which will shortly be published. Two ways of trying to quantify the Salmonian damn strange coincidence business. And a fourth topic which now slips my mind. So that's what we'll do next week. So if you're... Okay. Today I want to talk about psychoanalysis, and not about the metapsychology, and not even about the theory of the neurosis, but specifically about the psychoanalytic interview as a problem in inference. And if this interests you, I don't have my publication list here, but you will find in one of my papers is a very long paper in volume 10 of the Minnesota Studies in Philosophy of Science, and it's called Subjectivity in Psychoanalytic Inference. I think it is the most thorough, and I flatter myself, fair-minded treatment of that mess that anybody has ever written. And there have been a lot of dumb things written about it. There have also been some smart things written. But if you're really turned on by the question how one makes inferences in the psychoanalytic session, Meehl's article is the best yet. And you will also note how much cognitive dissonance or ambivalence or whatever I myself experience on the matter. Now, it's absurd to talk about persuading anybody that the psychoanalytic interview is a source of evidence who doesn't want to think so, or dissuading somebody who's already converted. So what is the point of this very brief session, considering the magnitude of what we're discussing? And it's simply to show those of you who are thoroughly immersed in the Minnesota Dust Bowl empiricist, quantitative, biological, scientific tradition, why a person not completely out of his mind could think that Freud had discovered some interesting things about how the psyche works. And that's all I'm trying to do, okay? I am not trying to make Freudians out of you. I'm only a 40% one myself. And I used to be a 60% one. So what am I up to today? Titillating your curiosity and arousing your interest and, in a sense, explaining myself. Namely, how can somebody who likes mathematics and philosophy of science and used to run rats think that there's something to Freud when all rational scientific psychologists know that it's all baloney? It's a strange thing that in academic psychology departments there's a tendency to think that Freud is about 90% hogwash, and then you go across the street to the humanities and they seem to think that there is no other theory of the mind. It's incredible. You find French professors, English professors, humanists and so on, and they don't even know that there's another totally different way of looking at the human psyche. Not to mention the deviance from psychoanalysis. They almost never mention Adler, or once in a while these days Jung. But that, of course, if you want to do literary criticism or understand history or whatever, or art criticism, why, of course, Freud is what you want to know about. It's really strange that there would be that much of it. It's the two cultures problem. So you've got one building in which people think Freud is totally discredited, never had much going for him, and then, as I say, across the street, you got a PhD who thinks if you want to apply psychology to understanding Ernest Hemingway, then, of course, Freud is the way you have to do it. In that case, maybe Adler's the way you'd have to do it. I don't know. Very unpleasant fella. All right. So aim, not to convert you to anything, but to arouse your interest. A little history first. How Freud hit upon the technique. I suppose most of you already heard that in Psych 1-2, but to refresh you, he was originally, when he went into private practice, using hypnosis and using it in the way that the French hypnotists like Charcot used it, namely to, quote, drive out the symptoms. If a patient was a good subject, was hypnotizable, then you would tell them that their paralysis was going to go away and hope that it worked. And sometimes it did, and sometimes it didn't. He tells us that he got kind of bored with it, mesmerizing people and pushing the symptoms away. And he went to study, first he had gone to study it with Charcot, and then later with Bernheim. And he observed a phenomenon with Bernheim that struck him, in that if Bernheim had a really good hypnotic subject who was capable of having a apparently total amnesia for the trance, and to whom Bernheim had given an instruction that he would perform such and such an act upon awakening. And as you know, people will do that, and they will cook up some excuse to make it reasonable why they're doing it. And that in itself is already impressive. That is to say that the brain is doing some computing and carrying out an instruction, and the person consciously thinks that he's doing it for some other reason that we would call a rationalization. But the other thing that he was struck with was that when the patient adamantly insisted that he could not remember anything that had happened since he heard the doctors say, sleep, 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 he couldn't remember a thing, nothing, and Bernheim would press the patient and hassle him and say, yes, you can, just keep thinking, or even, I guess, touch him. And then the patient would sometimes, not always, but some of them would begin to have glimmer of something that took place during the trance, and then Bernheim would press further, and then it would frequently come out in kind of a rush, that is to say, as if a gate had been lifted and the whole thing now became available. And that fascinated Freud. He said, what's going on there? There is some force in the way, something blocking the memory of the trance, and you have to get through that or lift it up or peel it off or something before this memory becomes available. And that's the kind of stuff, of course, if you're a smart, creative person, sits there and cooks and germinates in your mind. Now, it is kind of scandalous from a standpoint of history of knowledge, and it's kind of embarrassing for us as psychologists, at least those of us who are clinicians, to realize that we are now a century past Breuer's treatment of Anna O, and 89 years after the publication of what Freud considered his best book, The Interpretation of Dreams, which appeared in the year 1900. And here we are, that long after, and thousands of patients have been seen by hundreds and hundreds of psychotherapists, and an awful lot of books have been written, and the whole culture has been molded and shaped in various ways by this fellow Freud, and many different fields, anthropology and art history and literary criticism and psychohistory and so on, molded by it in different ways. I consider, although I know that some feminists look upon Freud as almost the arch enemy and worst male chauvinist imaginable, I consider that that is an injustice. The old guy was born, for God's sake, in 1856, and I think that his long-run impact was in the direction of liberating women, but I realize that is not commonly held. What's embarrassing is to think about all these smart people thinking about this and doing it and getting paid to do it all this time, and here we are, a century later, after Anna O, and if you ask, well, how much of it is true, nobody really knows. And that is embarrassing, isn't it? Nobody really knows. A lot of people will tell you that they know, but of course they don't. They just think they do. And when I was your age, I took it for granted by the time I got to be my present age that we would know pretty well how much of it is true. And I find it deeply disappointing in leading the life of the mind that I don't have much more solid conviction about what % of psychoanalytic doctrine is true now than I did when I was age 25 or 20. So there's a scandal, an epistemological scandal here. Now, in talking about the psychoanalytic session as a source of evidence, a source of knowledge to infer about how the mind works, the core concept, in my view, is theme tracing. That's the core concept in understanding the psychoanalytic hour, the tracing, the discernment of a theme or of a connection of related themes. And the way one thinks of the verbal behavior of a person on the couch is, here's the manifest content, as we say when we're talking about dreams, a bunch of words occurring in a sequence, and the background presupposition, the working hypothesis of the analytical therapist, whether he's an orthodox Freudian or a heretical one, but to the extent he's a Freudian at all and is engaged in what you'd call interpretive or analytic or psychodynamic therapy, is that there is a latent stream of processes going on here, and that these impinge on these. Now, you should never take that to mean, and a good analyst never interprets in a way that sounds as if he means that there's no intrinsic logical connection in the words that occur in the manifest content, or that the patient never is saying what he thinks he's talking about. That's a very clumsy way to interpret. And one never says to the patient, you're saying so-and-so, but what you really are talking about is, meaning that he's not talking about what he thinks he's talking about. It's not that he's not talking about what he thinks he's talking about, but that he's also talking about this. Also, not instead. He's talking about what he intends to talk about, even if he's free associating and not problem-solving oriented. And that's the instruction in classical analysis, as you know. Speak your thoughts. You're not supposed to edit or guide. You're not supposed to worry about whether it's been repeating. You're not supposed to worry how insulting it is to the therapist. So if you have the thought that's the ugliest damn ceiling I've ever seen in anybody's office, you have to say that. And you're not supposed to worry about whether you're boring him. He's getting paid, and so forth. Everything goes. You can say anything. You just can't throw the ink well, and so on. And the idea is that whatever is in the manifest content, there is a latent content which is influencing it in varying amounts, not the same in all sessions and not the same in all patients, and that influences both the content and the sequence and the form and the choice of words and the rate of speech and the pauses and the blanks and the gaps, etc. That's the core idea. If you're not operating with that as your core idea, then whatever else you're doing, you may be curing people like crazy. You're not doing psychoanalysis. That's the core idea, that there is a latent set of events, processes, states, unconscious fantasies, motives, repressed memories, defense mechanisms that is at work to guide this stream of speech when the patient is lying there doing his best to follow the fundamental rule. Usually written caps, by the way. Fundamental, cap F, cap R, the fundamental rule. All right. Let me show you how basic that is to the whole business. Let me read you a passage from my longish paper. It really will go better if I read this. I know students don't like that, but it'll go better if I read this. And I won't be reading other things except case material. An alternative subtitle which my non-Freudian colleagues urged upon me would be, "Whose mind does the mind reader read?" To motivate discussion of a topic not deemed important by some today, consider the story of the last Congress between Freud and Fliess, the rupture of their relationship at Achensee in the summer of 1900, the last time the two men ever met, although an attenuated correspondence continued for a couple of years. Setting aside the doubtless complex psychodynamics and the prior indications that the relationship was deteriorating, I focus on the intellectual content of the final collision. Fliess had attacked Freud by saying that Freud was a, quote, thought reader who read his own thoughts into the minds of his patients. Freud correctly perceived that this choice of content for the attack was deadly, that it went for the jugular. Freud's letter to Fliess after the meeting indicates that Fliess had written, apparently to soften the blow of the criticism, something about magic, which Freud again refused to accept and referred to as, quote, superfluous plaster to lay to your doubts about my thought reading, close quote. A year later, Freud is still focusing on the thought reading accusation. He writes, "In this, you came to the limit of your penetration. You take sides against me and tell me that, quote, the thought reader merely reads his own thoughts into other people," close quote. Italics in Freud, "which deprives my work of all its value. If I am such a one, throw my everyday life," that was the Parapraxis book, "unread into the wastebasket." In a subsequent letter, Freud quotes himself as having exclaimed at Achensee, "But you're undermining the whole value of my work." He says that an interpretation of Fliess's behavior made the latter uncomfortable, so that he was ready to conclude that the thought reader perceives nothing in others but merely projects his own thoughts into them. "And you must regard the whole technique as just as worthless as the others do. Not to belabor the point, it seems that when Fliess wanted to hurt, he knew precisely what was the tender spot, and so did Freud. So that in addressing myself to this vexed topic of the subjectivity of psychoanalytic inference, I am at least in good company in thinking it's important. Surely it is strange that 4/5 of a century after the publication of The Interpretation of Dreams, it is possible for intelligent and clinically experienced psychologists to reiterate Fliess's Achensee question, and it is not easy to answer it. Well, the one I passed out is rather far-fetched. Let me do one first that isn't quite as far-fetched. Yeah, it's better. Theme tracing. A high school student, we're not talking about psychoanalysis now, we're talking about counseling. A high school student is talking to a counselor about whether to go to the university or a smaller local college. He seems overly anxious. The counselor asks him a general lead question to get the overall picture as the student sees it, such as, suppose you tell me a little about yourself and your background. In the first counseling session, the following 5 spontaneous remarks occur. My father never had any education. I don't mean he was dumb. He just never went far in school. So I took some IQ test. I forget the name of it. They never told me the score, and I never asked. Naturally, a person wants to succeed at whatever he tries. Sometimes I think the simple life on the farm is best for people. One thing I will say for myself, I've always been a fast reader. You don't have to be a psychotherapist to trace a theme here, alluded to, hinted at, but never explicitly mentioned. Am I bright enough for college? He is scared, but the anxiety is presented in connection with which college. Note that not very much displacement has taken place. The presented problem is very close to the, quote, real one. Real one at the first level of analysis, of course. Why he feels intellectually inferior is a second question, which you may or may not be able to get to and may not need to. If you put these next to each other and read them in quick succession, as I did, these 5 allusions are fairly easy to interpret in the sense of discerning a theme. However, they don't usually come thus neatly packaged for us. Imagine the 5 spread out over your hour session. That is separated in time by an average of 12 minutes. Besides, each is embedded in its own content, in its own context, like a hidden figure puzzle. Thus, the remark about father's lack of schooling is in a context of giving you his ethnic, cultural, and family background. The remark about taking some IQ test is in the context of what his high school counselor advised him regarding choice of schools. The remark about succeeding is in the context of his older brother failing in the hardware business, which has cut down the family finances. Notice these are realistic things for the kid to be talking about. Remark about the, quote, simple farm life being better for people occurs in the context of his approaching summer vacation and how he looks forward to it. And the remark about his reading rate is in the context of telling you his extracurricular interests and hobbies, of which reading is one. So there's a nice, simple sophomore Bobby Soxer piece of theme tracing. You don't have to be Frieda from Reichmann to think of that maybe the kid's wondering, am I smart enough to go to college? All right, now here the plot thickens. Here's a little more complicated one. This is a patient that I supervised a therapist on in the 50s at the VA mental hygiene clinic at Fort Snelling. The therapist trainee here is Dr. Shirley Corrigan, who is in private practice in the cities. She doesn't mind my telling you about this. So we're listening to a tape. A veteran comes to the St. Paul VA Mental Hygiene Clinic with presenting complaints of tension, irritability, and attacks of what he himself describes as, quote, anxiety. The anxiety attacks typically occur at home. On rare occasions, they have occurred at work, but in every instance toward the end of the working day. The patient is married with 3 small children. It develops in the initial interview that he is unusually religious and is an adult convert to Roman Catholicism, which he spent some time studying intensively. He is a docile, conventional, and somewhat obsessional character. To the trainee, he reports the following dream. We were out in a field killing sheep. I would lift up the sheep to cut its throat. The sheep didn't seem to object, or even to be frightened. But each time, as I lifted the sheep up, it seemed there was an angel hidden underneath, which flitted away. The trainee asks him what comes to mind. You know, you don't have to have a patient on the couch 5 days a week to listen to a dream. The trainee asks him what comes to mind in thinking about this dream. And the patient's only association is to the sacrificial lamb idea in the Bible, which he links to the story of Abraham's trial of faith with respect to the intended sacrifice of his son Isaac. After these 2 brief associations, there is a pause. And then the veteran drops the dream and goes on to discuss his symptoms, his reactions to them, and their effect upon his life with a good deal of repetition and expressions of discouragement. He goes on along these lines for 15 minutes or so. The last symptom in this recounting was his increased irritability at home, especially when the children make too much noise. He then goes on to rebuke himself excessively with extreme condemning words such as, "It's a terrible thing to be so impatient," or, "I feel so ashamed of myself I can hardly stand it." He then develops the idea that actually his children are rather well behaved, which is all the more reason he should be more patient. And in the course of making this point, he says, not that they're little angels. I don't mean that, of course. The hypothesis which occurs to the listener, provided he takes note of the phrase little angels and associates it to the dream content. This was Shirley Corrigan's first therapy patient, and she hadn't noticed it during the interview, but I didn't have to mention it listening to the tape. She heard it right away as soon as she heard the tape. Is that the dream expresses the death wish against the noisy children, but is careful to make clear that sheep don't object to being killed. And anyway, the killing doesn't quite come off because attention is shifted to the angel, which flits away. The linkages between the angels in the dream and the reference 15 minutes after mentioning the dream to the children as little angels, together with lambs as objects of killing and which are helpless, dependent little creatures. On the Rorschach lamb content deals with need nurturance and need succorance, allegedly. The linkage... The choice of manifest content to express this via the religious domain of ideas is probably at least in part determined by the fact that the patient is conflict between his religious objections to contraception. Remember, we're in 1950. In the Roman Church, the local parish priest was hell on wheels about that at 1950. And converts typically are more legalistic than the people who were cradle Catholics, as we say. The choice of manifest content to express this via the religious domain is in part determined by the fact that the patient has conflict between his religious objections to contraception and his great fear of adding any more children to the family. Concentration of probing along these lines in the immediately following sessions was very fruitful and largely confirmatory of this construction. I would emphasize also that it was not necessary at any point to interpret the dream to the patient. Shirley Corrigan is not doing psychoanalysis on this guy once a week or 2 weeks. Rather, the therapist merely made use of her construction in guiding and interpreting the material of the subsequent interviews. Well, that one's a little more complicated. Well, let's see. Now, let me give you one that's quite a bit more complicated. A businessman in his late 30s whose wife had been a patient of mine, and he had refused to pay for her psychotherapy because he, quote, didn't believe in it, there's nothing to it. So she cashed an old insurance policy for payment. The wife benefited greatly to the point that he became interested. As a bright, verbal man of lower-class background, father was a junk dealer. A patient went to the University of Minnesota for almost 2 years as a pre-med. He quit ostensibly because the family needed money. This was in the Depression years that he was a student, but he was flunking physics at the time, and his overall grades would not get him into med school. His older brother, Herman, used to reprimand him for laziness. The brother got top grades, had a PhD in chemistry. For a while, the patient worked in the brother's drugstore. The brother was a pharmacist who finished graduate school while continuing in the drugstore business to make a living. I knew from the wife's therapy that the brother had mysteriously died during surgery in what was thought to be a fairly routine operation for stomach ulcer. The family having been greatly impressed by the fact that on the night before the surgery, Herman expressed with great dread and unshakable conviction that he would die on the operating table. Some of my physician colleagues have told me that they would never operate a patient who had that degree of fear. During the first interview, the patient related to me in a mixed fashion, including nonchalance, unconcern, a few minor problems, as he said, jocularity, deference, and competitiveness. I won't fully document these impressions as noted after the first hour, but as an example of it, he fluctuates between addressing me as Dr. and Mr., and once corrects himself twice in a row. Dr. Meehl. In the fourth session, he had reported a dream that was quite transparent, even prior to the associations, about a waiter who provided poor service, making the patient, quote, wait a long time before providing anything. Also, I couldn't say much for the meal. Now, I have learned, as most analytic therapists learn, that if your name lends itself to a pun, patients will characteristically do that in their dreams. So that when my patients dream about food, dinners, lunches, and tipping waiters and so on, they're frequently dreams of a transference nature. Just as in my analysis, I knew from a colleague of his that my analyst's nickname was Bus, and I had a homosexual dream in which I was run over by a big bus, and when I woke up, I thought the funny thing about it was really quite pleasant to be run over by this bus. So it didn't take too much work to interpret the homoerotic transference going on there. So, okay, so he couldn't say much for the meal, and the bill was exorbitant, he says, so I refused to pay it. He went off on discussion of ways his wife had and had not improved. He alluded to the parking inconvenience on campus. That's realistic. Time taken coming over here, and expressed the hope we can get this thing over fairly rapidly. At the end of the hour, I asked what the bill was. Now, back in 1951 or 2, believe it or not, we were charging people like $10 for 50 minutes of psychotherapy, so I assumed that that was the bill, my modest fee. And it was $10, he said. And I said, tell me something about this waiter. Well, he was blonde, blue-eyed, had a crew cut, which I had in those days, and a mustache, which I had, no beard. He gave an exact description of me, in other words, when he told me about the waiter. I asked directly what thoughts he had had about our sessions. He said he had wondered why I wasn't saying anything much. He contrasted our sessions disappointedly with some his wife had told him about, in which she had been fascinated by interpretations of her dream material. I then interpreted the dream and summarized the corroborating associations. He asked, when did you figure out what I had on my mind? I said I guessed it at the beginning, as soon as he told me the dream. Now, there's a debated matter of technique. That's partly because of my Radovian supervisor. I frequently become non-classical, following the practice of Freud himself, and some of his early colleagues said part of the educative phase in the early stage is to get leverage on the patient by establishing a conviction, a solid conviction that the process has a meaning. In other words, gut-level cognitive process. And that's okay to say that. Some people would say, what do you mean? What terrible. You shouldn't answer a question when he says, when did you think of this? After all these years, we don't even know the answer to a simple question of technique like that, see? Anyway, I told him when I thought of it. You mobilize suitable patients by engaging their cognitive needs, their need to understand themselves, and the sheer element of intellectual interest that is part of what aligns the observing ego to enter into the therapeutic alliance. The observing ego that looks at the experiencing ego. Part of what one does early is to engage the reality-based cognitive interest in the psyche, and it's are just not psychologically inclined, Freud says, are probably not suitable for psychoanalysis. If they can't distance themselves from their own puzzling experiences, they're unsuitable for psychoanalytic therapy. Any professional in psychiatry or psychology has had analysis will report his surprise during early sessions at the fact that, quote, all this stuff is even really true even for me. A lot of people who've taken courses in social science and tell you what Freud said about dreams and so on. I had a sociology professor once where the first time I interpreted a fairly complex dream, he flipped over on the couch and looked at me. He said, I'll be goddamned. It's really like Freud said, isn't it? Well, that's part of what you're doing when you make interpretations, getting some cognitive leverage. Well, my patients seemed very impressed by this. You got to be careful not to make it look like an upmanship thing, because then you're going to get a lot of flack that's not just negative transference. Which of us is cleverer, you know? But he seemed fascinated and chuckled, repeated, by God, that's fascinating to think I didn't know what I was talking about, and you did. In the fifth session, following the session about the waiter dream, the patient enters smiling, remarks before reclining, that sure was interesting last time. You knew all along what was going on, and I didn't. First dream, an Oriental, some kind of a big shot, Chinese ambassador or prime minister or something. He's hurt. He has a big bloody gash in his abdomen. Second dream, I am measuring out some pills from a bottle. You know, on the face of it, what the heck have those two things got to do with each other? Associations continued as follows. Drugstore with brother, patient was partner but not registered pharmacist. Times he put up prescriptions when the brother's not in. Nothing to some of them. Silly to take the task so seriously. Brother's PhD degree. He studied. I was lazy. Lacked ambition. Still do. Make more money if I had more. Brother also was brighter to start with. How bright am I really? Always caught on to things quickly. Poor work habits. Wanted to be a physician but not bad enough. I don't like doctors much. Haven't seen one in years. Some are pretty dumb. Then there's a long discussion of his wife's gynecologist who missed her diagnosis, whereas the patient diagnosed her correctly, as it turned out. In the drugstore, the patient used to advise customers about medication. He often felt confident he had diagnosed a condition their doctor wasn't treating them for. Then he rambles on about various incompetent physicians he's known over the years, detailed anecdotes with use of medical terminology, including the narrative of Brother Herman's unexplained surgical death, the insensitivity of the surgeon in poo-pooing Herman's fear, and then back reference to Herman's getting the PhD by brains and hard work. Then he comments on experts who don't necessarily know much more than an intelligent amateur. But he says, I wouldn't want to overgeneralize that. Pause. First, even brief pause in the stream of associations. Now, here one asks the tactical question whether to wait the silence out, which is sometimes appropriate, but in my experience, frequently not. I believe the tendency to wait it out regularly, as developed in this country during the 20s and 30s, is one reason for interminable analyses of people who are good prospects, but I can't prove that. We want to know what the patient is thinking that makes him pause, and I know of no really persuasive technical reason not to ask. So as soon as it's clear that this is a pause and we got resistance going, the first pause in the session, I say, what are you thinking? Says, I still can't get over our last session, that you knew what was on my mind when I didn't. Not just that I didn't, that's to be expected, but that you knew, that really gets me. Here, after the third overstressed phrase, you knew, I had an association. The previous night I had been reading Time. God. And saw a photo of the Burmese Prime Minister U Nu, spelled U-N-U. So one hypothesizes a pun, mispronouncing the name, and hence there is a linkage to me via this pun. Meehl, U Nu, the Oriental in the dream with the bloody gash. So I asked him for further thoughts about last session. He says, surprised. Pause. Go on. Impressed. What else can I say? Pause. Just keep talking. Taken aback, sort of. Why didn't I recognize it if you did? It's pretty obvious. And that $10 bill and all that stuff. Shouldn't take an expert to see that. Laughs. Question, any negative feelings at all? No negative feelings. Irked with myself. No resentment at all toward me. Now, at such moments, you have to be a little persistent. No, or if so, very faint. I'd hardly even call it resentment. All right, that's good enough. I beat it to death, I say, but a feeling as if I had sort of won around or had one up on you, perhaps. Laughs. A bit of that, sure. It's a kind of humiliating to go yakety-yakketing along and then find out you knew all along. So I suppose you could say there was a little element of resentment there. Yes, you could say that. Well, I couldn't resist. Of course, I had to ask him if he was reading last night. Yeah, I was reading Time. Well, what do you remember? Well, I was reading the sections on, I was mostly reading business and foreign affairs. See a picture in foreign affairs? Hey, by God, that Oriental in the dream was a photo in Time. Patient can't recall the guy's name, so I tell him it was you knew. And point out that again, as in the last session, we have a play on words involved. The dream shows how strong this reluctantly reported and allegedly faint resentment is, in that he has me wounded, or killed, or castrated, or made into a woman. Linked perhaps by the associations to his wife's vaginal problem and the professional's misdiagnosis, which were in his associations. And then there's the obvious connection with the abdominal wound that surgically killed his competitor, hard-working PhD brother Herman. The interpretation of this material led to some further fruitful associations regarding his competitive feelings toward his business partner, whom he had originally described to me as an entirely compatible and a, quote, sympathetic person. I had external evidence, not discussed with him, from the wife that, in fact, the business partner tended constantly to put the patient down, to underestimate his abilities, to pontificate to him about cultural matters in which the patient was as well as informed as he, such as music. The business partner, like Brother Herman, had completed his college education with high grades. As a result of this interpretation, some of the ambivalence toward the business partner came out more openly, and several subsequent sessions were especially fruitful in this regard. Now, let me pass out a couple of diagrams of some of the possible connections here. I say possible, plausible. I tend to believe at least some of them have validity because of the fact that I made a valid post-diction of what the fellow had been reading about, and once I got him to focus on Time and the picture, he recognized immediately the guy in the dream, the Burmese ambassador. One of those diagrams has got the sequence of the associations and the guiding, what I took to be the underlying latent theme of competitiveness with brother, me, other males, experts, doctors, people with degrees, and so forth. And that the associations, all of the things that he said that are listed along the side and bottom seem to me to be understandable as guided by that kind of a theme. Now, you can tell stories like that on and on and on into the night if you've done psychoanalysis or experienced it to a real tough-minded guy like my teacher Hathaway and not make a dent. And there you are. I mean, it's standoff, isn't it? If I tell that kind of a story, as I told this particular one in the Gardner Lindsay's personality seminar when he was here at Minnesota, And Lindsay turns to Hathaway, who was present and hadn't said anything, and says, well, Stark, how do you make of that? And Hathaway says, well, if Meehl wants to think that way about that, I have no objection. If he wants to think that way, yeah, it's a free country. Think that way if you feel like it. And that's a very unsatisfactory state of affairs in our discipline, isn't it? I mean, if all you can say is, I think there's a peachy keen way to think about this, and Ph.D. Hathaway, who's seen a lot of patients, says, well, I don't, but it's a free country, so if you want to, you gullible fellow, you at Sullivan Voce, well, go ahead. Very unsatisfactory. Well, let me give another. This is tracing a theme now of not quite like the theme tracing of the interview, but discerning a possibly latent theme in some parapraxes. A patient drops her wedding ring down the toilet. In speaking of her husband, Henry, she mistakenly refers to him as George, the name of an old flame. An evening dining out in celebration of their wedding anniversary was prevented because the patient came down with a severe headache. Without any kinds of challenge, to the contrary, she, quote, spontaneously makes 4 statements at different times in the same interview about what a fine man her husband is, how fortunate she is that she married him instead of somebody else, and so on. And the therapist hasn't been challenging any of that. She gives these 4 things. Now, you don't have to go through elaborate psycholinguistics or Bayes' theorem to argue that it may be simpler and plausible to attribute these 4 phenomena to the unreported guiding influence of a single psychological entity, some ambivalence about her husband, rather than explaining each one of them separately by a different hypothesis each. Follow that? That's like the house detective, isn't it? In the latter case, if we did it piecewise, we might attribute the wedding ring parapraxis to non-dynamic clumsiness, like maybe the patient is at the low end of the Johnson-O'Connor finger and tweezer dexterity test. That would be a Minnesota-type explanation, wouldn't it? The anniversary headache to insufficient sleep and over-smoking, the misnaming George for Henry to the fact that old George was in town recently and called her up, and the unprovoked overemphasis on her happy marriage to some recent observations on the unhappy wives that are neighbors on either side. So you see, you could have 4 hypotheses, and they're not all out to lunch, but if you plug in some conditionals, set some bounds on the conditionals and the priors, and plug all that into Bayes' theorem, it becomes quite reasonable to say that the posterior probability favors the one that explains all 4 of them rather than by one thing, rather than saying that we have the Johnson-O'Connor hypothesis in this one and this one to explain the other bits. There's nothing unique about psychoanalysis in that respect, is there? It's something about the messiness of it, but it's not the mere fact that you have competing hypotheses for bits and pieces of evidence, and that what we do, whether we're doing science, theoretical science, or we're the house detective, or figuring out a crossword puzzle, what we do, reading a murder mystery, what we do is say, what can I cook up that, if it were the case, would explain this and this and this and this and this fact, so that all those facts could be shown to flow from one big hypothesis, big H, rather than having little h1 explain f1, little h2, f2, and so forth. The extent to which that's rational obviously depends upon the plausibility of the competitors as regards their priors, and as the strength of the conditionals from each of them, and the priors on the facts themselves, absent theory. All of those being involved in the formal statistics of Bayes' theorem. So the point is, you do Bayesian statistics in your head even if you never heard of Thomas Bayes. And I've mentioned that fact before. If your doctor who never heard of Bayes' theorem says, when you tell him about your malaise and your diarrhea and this and that, and he says, you probably got the spring crud, there's a lot of it around, that's Bayes' theorem that he's relying on, but he never heard of it. So the brain does Bayes' theorem, not very well, as Tversky and others have pointed out, but it does it. You don't have to be a Bayesian in the strong sense of the statisticians who push that. to think Bayesian a good deal of the time. After all, even Fisher was willing to think Bayesian, provided you could list the urns that were involved. Well, why is there a philosophy of science problem here? Why is there a methodological problem about the evidence? If we keep at the abstract meta level I was just operating on, and we say, wow, what you've got is some data, namely patients talk. It's absurd to say that Freud didn't make observations or he wasn't empirical, because patients lying talking is an observation, and it's in space-time, and it's empirical. It's not experimental, and it's not quantitative, but it's obviously empirical. And so if one stays at the meta-linguistic abstract level and says, well, what's the problem here? You have some facts that the patient said this and said this and said this and changed his posture on the couch, and after he said this, and there was a long pause, and then he did that, and so these are facts. And if you get worried about whether they're facts at that level, you can videotape the whole deal and get people to agree that he turned over on the couch or that he said this very fast and this slow, and you can count all that stuff if you want to. So why is there a problem? What's the hang-up? I mean, how come 100 years to this, and we're in a situation where two perfectly rational people can say, well, we'll have to agree to disagree. You seem to think these things hang together in some goofy way that coheres, and I can see what you're up to. I'm not saying it's that you're psychotic. I can see these strands that you're drawing, but doesn't convince me. Doesn't convince me. What's the problem? Well, I think I can tell you what the problem isn't easier than I can say exactly what the problem is. I think there are a number of things that psychologists, American psychologists, think the problem is that it ain't. It's not primarily a conceptual difficulty. I mean, the notion that there is an unreportable set of events happening in the brain, if you like brain language, or that there's an unreportable sequence of things cooking in the mind, if you like mentalistic language, that indirectly controls the behavior, the verbal and gestural and postural behavior, doesn't have anything intrinsically wrong with it as a concept, does it? There isn't any reason why we should find that just inherently objectionable, that there are processes in the brain going on which have a certain kind of complexity, which have a certain kind of causal history, which have, even the sense we allow in computer language, a certain intentionality or purposiveness which the subject cannot report. Rats have expectancies, or at least so Tolman believes, and so do I. Computers search for proofs. Nobody finds it paradoxical to say, I've got my computer looking for a shorter proof of Thisbe's theorem. Simon did that back in the 50s. Found a shorter proof for a theorem in Principia Mathematica than the one that Russell and Whitehead had cooked up. And it's just natural language to say, what's your computer doing? Why, it's looking for a short proof of so-and-so. Not a distortion of language, but we do not attribute subjective aspects to the computer, do we, except in science fiction. That is, we do not think that the computer's feelings are hurt. If we say this is a dumb old computer, let's get a new one, or that it has pains in its transistors or whatever. So that the subjective conscious aspect or the self-reporting aspect is not something that's intrinsic to saying a complex kind of process involving scanning, abstraction, subsuming, inferring, classifying, discriminating, remembering, retrieving, storing. Those are all things that we apply quite literally to stuff that's made out of boron and so on, rather than out of protoplasm. Nor, I think, is it ontologically improbable. Some people think that, but when you ask them why they think that, they never give you a convincing reason. I've never heard a real convincing reason. If somebody said, I just think that's so improbable that there could be a theme like that one guiding this fellow's associations about Undu. I just think that's so a priori unplausible. And you say, why? What's so improbable about it? Admittedly, if the prior is very low, then you're going to have a hell of a lot of evidence to boost the posterior. But in my experience, people who tell you that it's very unplausible a priori are totally paralyzed and stupefied when you invite them to say why. There is no good reason for saying it's a priori unplausible that I know of. Take the baseball player. In the days before they went to college, I mean. He doesn't know the mathematics, differential equations involved in the mathematics of exterior ballistics, but he knows how to get to the right place at the right time out on the outfield to catch that fly. It's a hell of a complicated thing, like a dog pursuing something. I mean, this dog is doing differential equations, but not in the sense that you do when you take the course. His brain is computing them right of one plenty complicated thing, you know, due to evolution or the big committee in the sky or however it came about is being done. Or take the cat writing reflex. As a cat person, I like this kind of example. You know, the domestic cat, you can drop him. Well, I've tried it as close as I think 6 or 8 inches, not on the cement floor now, but on the bed. And by the time he hits, he's got the 4 paws down. You hold him upside down. Now, how does the cat do that? That's been carefully studied by the animal people, and we know exactly how he does it in terms of the physics. If you took physics, you remember that the moment of inertia of a flywheel is proportional to the radius of gyration, which is the mean distance out of all the mass of the thing. Corresponds to the standard deviation in statistics, by the way. And so that for a 10-pound flywheel has more inertia, and you have to apply more torque to get it going at a certain speed, depending upon how big it is. It's a fixed mass, variable radius of gyration. What the cat does, let's see, the head end happens first. What the cat does when you drop him and he's upside down is to extend the hind limbs. So that means that his rear end is a great big flywheel with a big moment of inertia. And he pulls in the forelimbs. And that means that the front end of the cat has got a small moment of inertia. And then the abdominal and back muscles operate so that if they're pulling, what's going to turn? And the answer is the thing with the small moment of inertia. So that means as he's falling through space, the head gets right up. And then when his head is approximately, not quite upright, that is, aiming right, so to speak, he extends the front paws and pulls in the hind paws and continues the contraction of the musculature, and so that turns his rear end around. That is one complicated thing. I mean, that cat has really got the physics of classical mechanics down pat, so to speak, and yet we know that the cat doesn't know anything about physics. He doesn't know anything about calculus or integrals or anything like that, or moment of inertia, or radial velocity, or who knows what it is, centrifugal force. Doesn't know any of that stuff, but is a deep sense in which his brain knows it, meaning it knows how to do it. What's the point of that story? It has nothing to do with psychodynamics. It just illustrates a simple truth that the nervous system of a mammal can do some extremely complicated things without being able to report on how it's doing the computing. That's what that's about. Or the famous stories of people who solve tough mathematical problems in their sleep. Many people, Poincaré was one of the famous ones, but other great mathematicians. Some have even said that they would deliberately think about a math problem before they went to sleep at night on the theory that they had a better than even chance of waking up with the solution in mind. And it's particularly interesting when the mathematician who does that wakes up with the answer and takes him several weeks of hard work to prove it. And that Poincaré reports examples like that. That's real spooky, isn't that? I mean, what the hell's your brain doing when it does that? You're a mathematician, you wake up with a proof of Fisby's conjecture, you write it down, and then you have to work for 100 hours to get a valid proof. How about that? You know. Post-hypnotic suggestion's another obvious example. People do fairly complicated things sometime to carry out a post-hypnotic suggestion. And make it plausible so that their rationalization will be acceptable at least to them, although other people think it's kind of hokey, even if they don't know that it's a post-hypnotic suggestion. So neither the objection that this is just sort of conceptually haywire, I don't accept, and the notion that although conceptually it may be all right, its prior probability is so darn small that no amount of evidence should persuade a rational mind. I reject both of those, and I have really never heard any strong argument defending either one of them. There's a lot of things to be said against psychoanalytic inference, and I'm going to get to one now, but those are not good objections. In my opinion, those are really very flimsy objections, and that somebody takes them seriously, and then when you ask, press for suggestions, another obvious example. People do fairly complicated things sometimes to carry out a post-hypnotic suggestion and make it plausible so that their rationalization will be acceptable at least to them, although other people think it's kind of hokey, even if they don't know that it's a post-hypnotic suggestion. So neither the objection that this is just sort of conceptually haywire, I don't accept, and the notion that although conceptually it may be all right, its prior probability is so darn small that no amount of evidence should persuade a rational mind. I reject both of those, and I have really never heard any strong argument defending either one of them. There's a lot of things to be said against psychoanalytic inference, and I'm going to get to one now, but those are not good objections. In my opinion, those are really very flimsy objections, and that somebody takes them seriously, and then when you ask, press for it, it turns out they haven't reflected on why they make that objection. Freud, of course, would say, well, that shows that they're defended against the ideas, because here's a person who's usually pretty smart and scholarly, and he gives me this crummy objection, and then I ask him why that, and he gives me a glassy stare. He just doesn't want to hear this stuff. Don't tell, he doesn't want to hear this stuff. Well, what is the problem? I think it's an epistemological problem, not a conceptual problem, and not a problem of low antecedent probability at all, but it's an epistemological problem, or if you like, an evidentiary one. And the epistemological problem, in a nutshell, is that there's too loose a fit, too many unknowns, to make a coercive argument. So that you have a kind of a plausibility argument where you say, well, look at this. Doesn't this sort of strike you, sort of hang together? And when you ask a person to look at an argument in that way, you can't derive any t-tests or correlations, but you just say, look at this stuff. Doesn't it sort of hang together? Well, that's a subjective matter. We, last quarter, discussed the fact that there's no algorithm for doing that. Carnap is dead and didn't get one. And the example I passed out of the Hauptmann murder case is the same kind of thing. But there, you have a feeling that you don't have as many degrees of freedom, that there aren't as many alternative things you could cook up, given that the gold notes were in Hauptmann's garage, and that he quit his job the day after the ransom was paid, and that the ladder found by the Lindbergh home after the kidnapping, the wood matched some wood in his attic, and stuff like that. And you begin to think, as this piles up, if I were going to invent a set of alternative hypotheses that did not involve his having anything to do with the kidnapping or the ransom money, I would have a huge set of things, each of which would have a moderate to low prior, and I would have it would just, the improbability of all that stuff coming together in this way is very impressive to us in a criminal case like that. But the point is, since there isn't an algorithm for doing inductive inference of that sort, we have this standoff when we have a situation that a person is either taken with it, grabbed by it, either has a funny feeling of what a damn strange coincidence, or he isn't. And if he isn't grabbed by it, you can't give him any numbers. You can't, if a person doesn't think that such and such an effect exists in a drug trial, you can keep piling on your t-tests and your small p-values until he recognizes that it's really irrational for him to hold out and continue to be doubtful. You can't do that here. The other thing that makes this epistemologically difficult is that the examples that are given as evidence by Freud are, of course, chosen from sessions in which things panned out rather well. Now, there's nothing wrong with that pedagogically. Obviously, if I'm going to explain to you how to play chess, I don't start out by showing you a real dumb endgame. If I want you to learn how to diagnose something, I don't take the most difficult case for starters, although that's the way they teach in the law school, by the case method. So that when Freud or anybody else writing or lecturing about psychoanalysis as a process and wants to explain to listeners, naive or, as here, sophisticated, why you think there's something to it, obviously, I'm going to take a cute one like the Uno example, and one where I even have a post-diction that pans out. And I'm not going to take one where I have a big mess of stuff that came out and a complicated manifest content, and at the end of the hour, I don't know what the heck was going on. And that is a very common situation. Only the most dogmatic psychoanalytic therapist thinks that he understands all the material. A typical session is one, a typical, mind you, brethren, a typical session is one in which some bits and pieces of themes are discernible with some confidence, and where some other things with low confidence, and where some other things you have no belief at all about how it came about. Not a clue, not a hint. And there was for years a controversy within psychoanalytic circles in Vienna and in the United States about whether you should always give the patient something. The idea being that an interpretation is one of the things that you give in return for the patient paying you money and being cooperative and coming on time and all. You should give him something, even if you aren't fixing him in a hurry. You should give him something. And what do you give in psychoanalytic therapy? You give interpretations, right? So some people said, no matter how far-fetched you think it is, you should tell him a little something at the end, even if you don't think very much of it. Now, my first analyst, Hy Lippmann, Vienna-trained, apparently believed that, because he always doled out an itty-bitty interpretative bit at the end of the session, and sometimes with great tentativity, and if I said, hogwash, it didn't seem to faze him. But he always gave me a little bit. He said, well, Paul, it occurs to me listening to your associations, did your father, and I'd say, no, you're all wet. Well, one of the main things about psychoanalysis is, of course, a modeling of infinite Buddhistic patience and placidity. We got plenty of time, like 10 years, and that has a certain advantage. It can be very bad for certain ruminative intellectuals who don't want to get off their ass and do anything about their problem. But it does have a certain advantage, because one thing about the neurotic mind, as analyst Elvin Semrad once said to me, you know, Paul, the neurotic is always busy, doing this, warding that off, preventing that, and so on. And that atmosphere is totally different in psychoanalysis. You know, you throw out a hypothesis, you don't like that? You know, put it on the shelf. It might come around 3 months. We look at it again, and so forth. And that part of the modeling of it, things are not so damn spastic after all, you know. The grim quality of the neurotic's mind that permeates so many things, ruins his sex life, because sex is a grim rather than a playful thing for neurotic people. And his work is grim. Everything's grim. And you're hurried, and you're spastic, and you're running, and as Satchel Paige says, they may be gaining on you. And the psychoanalytic session is just, all of that stuff is in a way put on the shelf, because we got lots of time and we can examine a possibility. You don't like this one? It's a free country. You pay your money, you take your choice. And that flavor is very, very good for the spasticity that characterizes neurotic people. Whereas my second analyst, Gluck, who was, I think I told you, started out to be a surgeon and then went into analysis, he was much more directive, but he was also didn't have the view, which apparently Rado didn't teach at Rado's heretical institute, that you always had to give an interpretation. So sometimes I'd be lying there thinking I was being very cooperative, not at least consciously editing, following the fundamental rule, And at the end of the session, after 50 minutes, I don't know what the hell I'd been talking about, and if I asked him, he would sometimes say, well, beats me. You know? What do you think he might say? And he had no apparent urge that he had to deliver something each time, and his view, as I later, when he supervised me, and I was engaged in research with him after my own analysis, we talked about stuff like that, the difference between him and High Lippmann's technique, and he said that he didn't really believe the business about you have to give people something, listening attentively and not hitting them is already giving them something that maybe their folks didn't. And furthermore, he said, especially with intellectuals and professionals, he says, I think it's a bad idea to offer an interpretation that you yourself have no faith in, because it makes it kind of a freewheeling, how far is the moon, let's guess, sort of thing. So he thought that that was counterproductive. Well, there again, you see, such a simple matter of technique. Do you always interpret, or do you sometimes not? There again, after 100 years, we don't know the answer to that one. Well, so since the typical session is one which is only understandable in part, and since there are quite a few sessions, I don't know what percent, that are hardly comprehensible at all, and not always because the patient is in a high state of resistance, you have a statistical sampling problem then. You see how that arises? We got 1,000 psychoanalytic sessions, and 10 of them are as persuasive as the UNU one is, at least to me. And then we got 200 that are somewhat persuasive, and then 300, and you've got this array of sessions with varying degrees of interpretability, so that someone who finds the anecdotal kind of evidence unpersuasive can make a very strong argument to the following effect. You, of course, there's a limited number of possibilities. There's a finite number of human motives. There's a finite number of defenses. You don't require that you can fit everything together like a jigsaw puzzle. Freud makes that analogy, and that, of course, is not a valid analogy, is it? In a jigsaw puzzle, if there's one damn piece missing, you know there's a hole there, right? And whereas in the case of psychoanalytic session, since normally not everything is fitted in, and since there are not clear contour lines that you can tell you're forcing this thing, say, it doesn't go in there, you don't have the double determination that you have with a jigsaw puzzle. So Freud shouldn't have used that analogy. It makes it sound as if you do it right, it all hangs together real tight. Well, that's not true, see. A case like this, the UNU example where, say, 90% of what the patient had to say can be seen as flowing from this theme that I've drawn in the middle, is the rare one. It's the rare one. So that the critic has a very powerful argument that's of a statistical character, even though he doesn't use any numbers, but it is essentially, it's a statistical kind of objection, isn't it? He says, you got this huge number of hours, and you got a couple people thinking about how they could make this stuff that comes out with free association cohere. How could they impose a pattern upon it in terms of some hidden motive and defense that would explain it? And over here, there's a big batch, hundreds and hundreds, that they can't do it with. It's not just that the patient doesn't buy it. The analyst doesn't even have one. He's like, my analyst, look, beats the hell out of me. What do you think, Paul? And then we got these in which there's some chunks, and then there's some others that are left over from the jigsaw. And then we got a few real cute ones, like the UNU example. And the critic says, well, it's sort of like this. It's if I imagine a limited number of possible themes and drives and emotions and defenses, and human ingenuity being what it is, well, it's not surprising that from time to time you should get an example like UNU. And, of course, those are the ones you pick out and put in your brilliant book, right? Or in your not-so-brilliant lecture, right? That's right. I don't ordinarily, if I'm supervising students or lecturing on psychotherapy, I don't ordinarily go on for hours and after hours with something that neither the patient or I understands. We should do more of that, by the way. I mean, the study of therapeutic failures is one of the things that therapists tend not to want to undertake for obvious reasons. So that's not a dumb objection, is it? I don't put that in the class of a rationalization for not taking it seriously. I take it as a real good, solid gold, serious epistemological problem. We have basically a problem of a large mess of talk that is found in various sessions called psychoanalytic hours, and we have a certain limited number of human motives and drives and fears and things that we have to play with, that we can stick in to make an explanation of how this gunk hangs together, and then behold, we find out that very often we can't do that worth a damn, and then quite frequently we can do bits and pieces, and then once in a while we can make the whole thing be almost like Freud's jigsaw puzzle analogy. Not quite, but almost. That's a powerful objection. Now you might say, well, gee whiz, that must happen in other fields as well. I mean, why should that be peculiar to the psychoanalytic hour as an evidentiary base? Well, it isn't peculiar to it. It does happen in other fields. I think it happens in almost all documentary fields. That is, fields that do not involve controlled experiments or absent experiments, high-powered statistics. I think it happens in history as a field. Historians get into arguments about causality that can go on for 100 years, and they don't settle them. And there's one group of historians, the cliometricians, who say, well, that's because they don't use factor analysis or path analysis. And then there's the other group, the old-fashioned documentary historians, that say that this cliometrics business is just a bunch of baloney and oversold and it doesn't work and blah, blah, blah. It's a big controversy. People even form separate organizations so that they don't have to listen to these other guys that don't see the world rightly. Get very put out with one another. Big deal. And so you take some big historical problem on which we have a fair amount of archaeological and documentary evidence, namely the fall of Rome. Have I talked about the fall of Rome? Okay. Well, there's 7 theories. I don't remember the 7. And one of them that I always liked is that everybody, the upper classes, drank the wine out of these pewter dishes and they got organic brain damage from it. It's not absurd. Could be. The proletariat didn't because they were using gourds or wooden things. And if you get enough lowering of the IQ among the smarties that run the society, then you're down the tube and the Huns can come in. Well, you got 7 different explanations. And they're not, it can't apparently be settled. They have a certain plausibility about them. Or if you take macro theories of history, such as Toynbee or Spengler, I'm a great pusher for Spengler's Decline of the West, despite all its terrible defects. Great book, terrific book. Man was a genius. Is a nut, but he's a genius. And you say, well, I read Spengler. It didn't impress me very much. And I say, sure impressed me. Boy, I can see that. I can just feel us going down the drain in the West. Glug, 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 glug. Japanese are going to take over. And what do you do with an argument about Spengler? You don't. People, it's a standoff. There's no statistics in there, and if somebody doesn't find all those cute examples about how, in some deep sense, the symbolism of the Gothic arch, and as well as the use of gunpowder to propel things, and the idea of the check, and what else? The differential calculus. He says if you have the right deep understanding of themes, you realize that these all express Faustian man's prime symbol of infinite space, as opposed to classical man's prime symbol of the naked human body, and Islamic man's prime symbol of the cavern, and so it goes. Well, I kind of like that. I get quite persuaded reading Spengler, despite the Teutonic Wagnerian garbage, and yet I know people who read Dave Lick and couldn't get past about page 15, and he's a bright, thoughtful man that likes to think about society and not too much of an arch behaviorist either, but he said, I couldn't stand it. I couldn't do any more of it. I can't understand, Meehl, how you can read this stuff like that. Well, so history, I think, as a discipline, when it gets into causal analysis, as opposed to what should we say, that there's a kind of history which is extremely close to the facts. I mean, it's hardly above the raw facts. and it confines itself to determining whether a certain document is genuine, or did St. Paul write the letter to the Thessalonians and stuff like that. And if it avoids sort of macro, big-scale theoretical understandings of the kind that Spengler was interested in, then you can get reasonably good convergence. But if you go much beyond that, very little beyond that, then you can find these controversies that remain unresolved. They go on and on and on and on. So you can decide whether Napoleon was ill at the Battle of Waterloo, and that was part of the problem, or you can find out how many slaves actually went through the Underground Railroad before the Civil War, and you can answer that. But if somebody starts an argument about whether the economics of slavery was or wasn't on the way out and stuff like that, already you get in an area in which they don't agree, and they can have an argument that continues for 100 years. The same problem applies to another documentary discipline, paleontology. The theory of evolution, as I have said before, is not all it's cracked up to be, in my opinion. That does not mean I'm a Baptist creationist, but I think the theory of evolution is somewhat oversold. And paleontology is one of its weakest and flabbiest sections. So the people who died in the world creationists, who, rather than people like me who say, I think this theory needs some real serious amending, something's rotten there in Denmark there, but people who really want to say it's false, they point, for example, to the famous horse series, you know, Eohippus and the ones you've all seen, and they say, how come it's always that damn horse that we see? And the answer to that, brethren, if you've never taken a course in fossils, is that the reason it's always that damn horse is it's the only good example that the boys have. And that's very embarrassing for the paleontologist. So somebody could say, well, it's the same problem in paleontology that it is in history and it is in psychoanalysis. Namely, there's a lot of fossils, thousands of extinct animals, trilobites and mammoths and so on. Awful lot of them. Hundreds of thousands of different species of insects. What is it? 825,000 species of insects, for Pete's sake. I don't know why the committee wanted so many. And so you say, well, they got all these different kinds of animals, and you're digging up these rocks, and naturally from time to time you will find a sequence of the rocks, as defined, say, by radium dating or whatever, or by index fossils, in which you can make a plausible arrangement, and the horse is one. Big deal. That's why that's the one they always put in the Britannica, see? But they don't have any other good ones. Same argument made there is made against the interpretation of dreams. I mean, it's a different domain. It doesn't deal with the mind, but it's the same argument that you get in any documentary discipline when there's a possibility of human ingenuity rearranging things in a certain pattern to make sense out of them, rather than doing an experiment where you manipulate and predict and control. Or controversies as to whether the Soviet Union would have become the kind of bloody tyranny it became if it hadn't been for Stalin's personal paranoid personality versus the people who say, no, it was indigenous to the damned ideology. Already Lenin was shooting the Mensheviks. And it comes out of the concept of the dictatorship of the proletariat. It comes out of the class think of Marxism, which says, for instance, well, you don't have to worry about the bureaucrat because surely the proletariat wouldn't exploit itself. Well, if you think that way, that sounds rather paradoxical. If you think like an ethologist rather than a Marxist, you say, oh, I'm not talking about the class doing it to a class. I'm talking about who's going to be the alpha baboon and get the goodies. And that's a different way of analyzing it. Now, some other things that people find convincing, but which we don't know how to quantify or objectify, so that the skeptic is quite unimpressed, is sudden effects, step functions. When something happens very quickly, to a marked extent following an interpretation, it's hard, if you're the patient, not to think that there is something important has happened. Let me give you one from my analysis. I was walking about half a block from the U hospitals to keep my appointment. I was in kind of a neutral mood, neither up nor down. and watching the cars and the people passing, and I perceived approaching me a man and a woman in their late 30s, both with troubled facial expressions, the woman weeping, and the man was carrying a brown paper sack and over his arm a large Raggedy Ann doll. It's not enough surprising that the thought occurred to me from their behavior and the doll, and that they were leaving the U hospitals, that a child was very ill or possibly a child had just died. That's not a goofy thought to have given those circumstances. But that isn't what happened to me, merely to have a little sympathetic grieving. I was flooded suddenly with a deep and terrible grieving and started to weep. I don't mean get a little tear, I mean weep as I walked. And I couldn't stop. I got on the elevator in the university hospital, and tears pouring down my cheeks, and I said, what the hell am I doing here? This is ridiculous. A couple of the clinical psych students were on the elevator, and they looked at me somewhat embarrassedly and said, good morning, Dr. Meehl. I said, good morning. Jeez. And they tried to act as if they hadn't noticed the state that Professor Meehl was in. I couldn't stop this weeping. I mean, it was not just sniveling, and stuff like that. So I had to wait a minute or two, and the previous analysand emerges, a social worker that I knew, and I go in, lie down on the couch. I'm still crying. And I describe briefly, hardly able to talk, that I tell about these people that I saw. And my analyst says, were you harsh with Karen this morning? That's my 5-year-old daughter. Well, I had been at breakfast, really chewed her out for some minor thing. I felt impatient and guilty. And so, of course, we know what the theme was that was cooking. Now, the interesting thing is that all he had to say was that sentence. Were you harsh with Karen this morning? And the thing completely liquidates. You see, that's quite different from a painful working through or something. It doesn't have to be controlled. It's just dismissed like a spook, gone, you know, just gone. I didn't have to try to stop, just no input. It just absolutely dried up immediately from that one interpretive remark. Well, it's hard not to be convinced, you see, of something like that when you're the subject. Boy, it's more convincing than Sears' monograph on objective studies of psychoanalytic concepts any day. Maybe it shouldn't be. I'm just saying that people who get convinced about psychoanalysis get convinced from their couch time and not from reading the studies. I think I told you the way I convinced my Skinnerian wife there was something to Freud when we first got involved was to interpret some dreams for her. I only interpreted the good ones. The ones I couldn't figure out, I said, it beats me. But it took me about 6, I think, 5 or 6, and she said, my God, that's stuff. That's true, isn't it? That's true. He had something there. All right, let me give you another step function example. A patient I recall that had very bad doctor phobia, and she had some health problems, and she should have seen a physician, and she couldn't make an appointment with the doctor. I mean, she couldn't call up and make the appointment. And we were into, I don't know, 50 sessions maybe, and a lot of things had improved in various ways, but this darn medical phobia, which was not her presenting complaint, had not abated one tiny bit. Why do I mention that? Well, because you could say it was suggestion, what you're going to tell me. She had improved in a lot of ways. That one was untouched. And I had formed a construction about childhood masturbation guilt business and a fear of a physical exam at the child often has the fantasy the doctor can tell by looking at their genitals whether they masturbate or not. And she was brought up in a very strict Calvinist Dutch Michigan family in which masturbation was a terrible thing. And I had reconstructed this in my mind, but I hadn't said a damn thing, even hinted at it. And we finally got a distinct memory of a pre-adolescent memory in which she recalled with great anxiety and feelings of nausea saying, maybe you better bring the wastebasket over here. I'm afraid I might throw up on your floor, but she didn't. Sitting on the examining table and the doctor talking to her about this. And at the end of the session, she gets up sort of shaken and made some remark about she didn't know whether I had suggested this to her, but it certainly had a very genuine feeling about it, that it was real. And the next morning, she called me up and said, maybe I'm calling up just to hold your hand, but I called up yesterday after I'd been home a couple hours, and And I called up and made an appointment to see Dr. Glotz, and I worried that this morning I wouldn't dare to, but I feel a little antsy, but not much, and I'm about to drive down for my appointment. Well, you know, it's hard not to think that this was what Freud calls a cold abscess in the mind, and that lancing that cold abscess in the mind due to this experience was actually the thing that gave a step function her ability to go and see a physician. Prediction, if we could do more prediction in the session and have some way of quantifying the improbability a certain prediction would come out right, that would be helpful. That's also very persuasive. Let me give you an example of that. Patient begins the session by reporting. I dreamed there was a peculiar water pipe sticking into my kitchen. That's all the manifest content. Well, by Rodovian training, I make a minor intervention because I want to be thinking as she talks, so I say, peculiar? Yes, she says it was a peculiar water pipe because it seemed to have some kind of a cap on it. I couldn't understand how it could work. Now, the standard symbology here, of course, the water pipe is a penis symbol. The kitchen is a standard female genital symbol, as in the slang phrase for cunnilingus, clean up the kitchen. Is familiar to undergraduates, but knowing it would only permit the trained clerk or super-trained clerk to infer a heterosexual wish, the water pipe sticking in the patient's kitchen. What makes it more interesting is the peculiar cap, which is juxtaposed with I can't see how it would work. Work is a coetal thing in classical theory. So here I get a low-frequency thought mediated by the fact that the patient is Jewish and I am Gentile. And I conjecture that the capped pipe is an uncircumcised, i.e. Gentile penis, and that the dream expresses an erotic positive transference impulse. But I further conjecture, not of course to her, that the current manifestations of these transference feelings involves negative feelings towards her husband, unfavorable fantasied comparisons of him with me, and that the focus of these comparisons will be somewhere in the Jewish-Gentile domain. Both of my analysts were Jews, and both of them told me, and I found it my experience with Jewish and Gentile patients, if the patient or therapist is Jewish and the other one is not, that theme will invariably play a role in the associations. Absolutely 100% predictable. Well, so I'm expecting now the theme of the rest of the session. It's going to be not merely a positive thing about me, but it's going to involve some unfavorable comparison of the husband. So then I shut up. So I've said one word, peculiar, just to find out what's peculiar about this pipe. So I remained silent until the last 5 minutes. Everything the patient talked about during that period alluded directly or almost directly to my conjectured theme. I don't have space to present all of her associations, but here's an example. She recounted a recent episode in which she and the husband visited a drugstore with whose proprietor the husband had formerly done business. The patient was irritated with her husband because he slapped the counter and put his hand on the druggist's shoulder and asked in a loud voice how the profits were going. The patient noted the presence in the store of a slightly familiar neighbor woman of hers named Stenquist, who the patient mentions is a Norwegian Lutheran. She knew from the newspapers and other sources that I was at that time a Lutheran and of Norwegian ancestry. She had a conscious thought in the drugstore that her husband was, quote, carrying on exactly the way the anti-Semites have the stereotype of the way Jewish people talk and act in public. She then talked about a non-Jewish boy she had gone with briefly in high school, but quit because her parents disapproved of this goy, emphasizing that he was, quote, quiet and, quote, somewhat shy and had, quote, very nice manners. She went on to say she liked men who were gentle. Notice the further possible phonetic link between Gentile and gentle. And after a bit of silence, said that she realized it was the therapist's business to be gentle in my treatment of her. Applies to all of us. But she imagined I was the same way in real life. Then there was some more hesitation. And then she starts complaining that sometimes her husband was not gentle in bed. And then there's a long pause. I just wait this one out. And finally she gives me a reluctant expression of the thought that Meehl would no doubt be gentle in bed. So that the whole rest of the session was like that. It was a jigsaw case, and practically everything fits into this one theme of an erotic transference on me and connection with an unfavorable comparison with her husbands. Well, I guess I can give you this one final example here. I usually follow a crude rule of thumb to avoid intervention until I receive at least 2 fairly strong corroborator associations. And that's the kind of thing, if we could get some kind of statistics on, we could begin playing quantitative games, right? You make a prediction, you have some notion what the prior incidents, either of this patient or patients in general, I would want to do both, of a certain kind of remark or cluster of remarks alluding to a theme would be, and see how good a job you do predicting. For example, if the corroborators are weak or middling, I tend to wait for 3. Clinical example, the manifest content of a male patient's dream involves reference to a urinal, so one conjecture, doubtless at higher strength because of previous material, is that the ambition, achievement, triumph, shame theme is cooking. In male patients, a dream about fire and water, if you shut up, the rest of the session will, in my experience, almost invariably deal with ambition as a theme, as a motive, and shame as its counterpart as an affect. Halfway through the hour, he passingly alludes to somebody's headgear and suddenly recalls an unreported element of the manifest content. Now, that's usually important, Freud says. Oh, by the way, I left out, to wit, that hanging on a wall peg in this urinal he dreamed of was a, quote, green hat. This recalls to my mind, although not to his mind, apparently, unless he's editing, a reference several weeks ago to a green hat. The patient had an uncle of whom he was fond, and he used to be an avid mountaineer, given to recounting mountain climbing exploits. Sometimes when the uncle was a bit in his cups, he would don a green Tyrolean hat that he had brought from Austria. The uncle had several times told the boy the story about how Mallory, asked why he wants to conquer the Matterhorn, replied, because it's there. The uncle would then usually go on to say that this answer showed the true spirit of the dedicated mountain climber, and that it should be the attitude of everybody toward life generally. We may choose to classify the passing allusion to a green hat as belonging to the same thematic cluster as this material. Later in the session, if it doesn't emerge spontaneously by a return to that element, we may decide to ask the patient to say more about the hat, ascertaining whether he says it was a Tyrolean hat, and even better, a Tyrolean hat, quote, such as my uncle used to wear. I call this a strong corroborator for the obvious reason that the base rate of green hat associations for patients in general, and even for this patient, is rather small. That generalization isn't negated by the fact that he once before had this thought. Once in scores or hundreds of hours is still a pretty low base rate. I'll read the rest of this. But more important is the fact that the sole previous mention is what enables us to link up a green hat with the achievement motive. On the other hand, the presence of alternative and competing hypotheses lowers the corroborative power of a short-term prediction. How much it is lowered depends on how many competitors there are, how good a job they do of subsuming it, and especially the antecedent probability we attach to each. This prior is based upon general experience with patients in our clientele, but also, of course, on the base rate for the particular patient. For example, in the present instance, the patient, though not an alcoholic, has reported a minor drinking problem and has revealed, although it has not been interpreted, a linkage between alcohol and the homoerotic theme. The uncle's tendency to tell this story when in his cups and his further tendency to get a little boy to take a sip of beer produces an unwelcome combination of competing hypotheses, that is, having nothing to do with need achievement. Well, one procedure that I proposed at the end of this article I mentioned in Minnesota Studies, it was a block theme naming method, in which you would parse the session on the basis of the manifest content. You could have that done by somebody who knew nothing about Freud, if you could find any literate people anymore who don't. Just say, I want you to, when he stops talking about the drugstore and starts talking about gynecology, that's a different kind of stuff. Okay, we make little 3x5 cards with the things parsed at the manifest level. And then you would give these individual cards to some psychoanalytically trained clinicians and have them say what theme they thought was involved for the card. And you'd get a distribution, see. They wouldn't all point to the same thing. Then you would take those themes and give them back to either these or maybe some new experts and have them rate or Q-sort or however you want to do it, how much confidence they would have in a particular theme is alluded to by this particular chunk of verbal material on a little card. And then you would arrange those themes in order of their weight or how have Q-sort placement or however you wanted to do it, and see whether reading along horizontally you would see that there was one theme that appears in each of these columns and fairly high up. And that would be a straight-out numerical problem. Why am I doing it in that goofy, indirect way? Well, the problem is that the process here involves a certain amount of skill in thinking about the stuff in this way. Psychoanalysis is a way of thinking, as my wife says. It's a way of thinking, just like money is a way of thinking. Some people have money think, and some people don't. And Marxism is a way of thinking, and psychoanalysis is a way of thinking, as Skinnerian behaviorism is a way of thinking. And you can't do it if you're not familiar with this way of thinking. But anybody who has been taught how to do it by his own couch time and by control cases and by case seminar and by reading the books, his mind is now theoretically poisoned, right? He has become indoctrinated. Now, there's no contradiction between saying it takes a trained, expert, skilled person to discern so-and-so, and saying a person who has been trained, experted, and skilled in a certain doctrine has biases, right? There's no contradiction between those two. They're both perfectly good methodological remarks. But they produce, even though they're logically consistent, they produce a tension epistemologically, because the only people that are likely to be able to see this stuff when it gets above my level of the counselor example are people who have been immersed in it, who've had some couch time, have been supervised, have listened to sessions, read Freud and reread Freud. I reread Freud collected works about every 10 years, the whole damn set, even the corny ones. And so your head is fixed so you think this way. But, of course, if your head has been fixed so you think this way by your own couch time and by your reading and by the people you talk with and stuff, that means that your classification is influenced by the way you're thinking. So from the standpoint of discernment, we want you to be able to subsume it in this, we hope, reasonably clever and subtle way. But from the standpoint of epistemology, then the fact that I can get a bunch of people who have been thus brainwashed and indoctrinated to agree. Now, some people seem to think that high interjudge reliability proves something in a matter like that. Well, it doesn't, of course. Low reliability will disprove something. High reliability just means that you went to the same damn analytic institute. And that's all it proves, right? Doesn't prove anything else. So if Jones and Smith and Fisby all were trained by Karen Horney, they'll think like her. And so they'll have high interjudge reliability, and it won't prove anything at all about the patient. Will it? Nothing. It proves you can shape up people's verbal behavior. See? So what we need to study the darn process, we need some way, of which my block theme tracing is not a very high-powered way of doing it, I guess, but we need development of methods in which we can take advantage of the skill and training of the analyst in terms of initial categorization of something, and yet to get some numerical cross-categorization procedure that can be done automatically or numerically, so that you don't have the somebody look at the whole table and say, yeah, looking at that, I get the following strong conviction. That's what we want to steer clear of. So we have people do it atomistically by small chunks, and then we count themes crosswise. Now, that may not be a very powerful way to do it, but it's at least it's one approach. You've got to solve the problem somehow of using the psychoanalytically trained observer as the instrument, also as the instrument of interviewing, don't forget. When to intervene, when to say, what are you thinking, and when to shut up. If you go back, as you often do, and say, well, halfway through the hour you talked about this green hat, can you give me some more thoughts about green hats? There's great degrees of freedom there, isn't there, as to what you pick up. And on the one hand, we say, well, of course, if you have some skill and you have a good theory in mind, then you will be better able to pick it up than some doing it random. But you can turn that argument around and say, well, of course, you've got the kind of theory that looks for such and such in relation to hats as a symbol, and because of that, you naturally are going to pick that one out, and therefore you are slanting the patient's attention, and also by your obvious interest in certain subjects, shaping up his verbal behavior. That I didn't even mention, but think what a powerful, terrible problem that is. You're teaching the patient how to talk about his mind when you make interpretations. So that problem of how to get the advantages of a skilled, trained person who knows how to ask and how to listen, especially how to listen, and to do theme tracing when it gets more complicated than the simple cases, without paying the price that all you're studying is that somebody went to Fisby's Psychoanalytic Institute, so you know how he's going to think. And that's a very tough problem for us, epistemologically. Well, it's 5 o'clock, so we did it. And next week we'll talk about some very different kinds of things. Have we got any extras of things that I passed out, by the way?